Final Fantasy XVI is a broad step in a new direction, at least for the mainline series, and as a result, is the most finalist Final Fantasy to have ever been fantasied. When I called 15 the most divisive game in the franchise, I lied. In my experience, 15 was the most divisive I'd seen firsthand, since I played that at launch and followed its many updates. However, every Final Fantasy is pretty divisive, and it's been that way since the release of 8 for various reasons that I'm sure I'll get to in 7 years. But last year's Final Fantasy XVI has seen lots of critical acclaim, as well as some fan pushback for what it's added to the franchise. And after putting about 50 hours into the game, from playing the main story, replaying some missions in arcade mode, as well as doing some post-game stuff, 16 has to be one of the most interesting Final Fantasy games in existence, and offers something completely new and unique that I think will turn a lot of newcomers into instant fans. It's not perfect, if anything, it's one of the more flawed games I've played in the last year or so, but in its own way, it's immediately become a modern classic. But this isn't a video where I can just ramble on for forever. We have a lot to cover here. Most of it's going to be about the story, which I'll summarize as quickly as I possibly can. 16's story takes place in the world of Valisthea, and is all centered on Clive, the oldest prince in Rosaria, friend of Jill, and shield for his younger brother Joshua, who holds the power of the Icon Phoenix. Icons are basically summons, and they play a much more central role here than they have in any other previous installment, even 10. The narrative starts off like a standard enough Final Fantasy game with an interesting premise about two brothers. One who is rejected by the Phoenix and thus shunned by his mother and works to overcome that shame, and another who was gifted with the power of the Phoenix, doted on by his mother, but paradoxically lives in his older brother's shadow. It seems like enough setup for any other game. But then, everyone dies! Joshua and Clive's mom, Annabella, betrays the kingdom of Rosaria by working with Sanbreque, a completely different kingdom on the other side of the continent, whose soldiers raid their camp and kill their father in front of Joshua, leading to the collapse of the kingdom of Rosaria since Clive is forced to become an imperial soldier. Joshua is presumed dead after the Phoenix lost to a second fire icon, Ifrit, which shouldn't be possible, and Jill was taken into slavery, since bearers, those who have the ability to use magic, and dominants, those who could summon icons, are treated as a second class. Dominants are seen as tools of destruction made to win wars, and bearers are owned by their masters, forced to use their powers until their bodies eventually succumb to petrification. There is so much lore in 16 that I keep thinking that I'm fucking forgetting something. 13 years after the fight between Ifrit and Phoenix, Joshua is revealed to be alive. Obviously, and Clive discovers that he's Ifrit, the second fire icon. Plus, he's somehow able to absorb the powers of other dominants. Gee, I wonder if that's going to be plot relevant later on. The three of them eventually cross paths again, meeting other people along the way like Sid, Gav, and Dion, the kind of stepbrother to Clive and Joshua since their mom married his dad and made a son. Kind of. Also, shouts out to Dion for being the first openly gay Final Fantasy character. It's a shame they don't get a happy ending though. And they all work together and decide to destroy the Mother Crystals, which give magic to bearers by sucking the life force out of Valisthea, causing the Blight. Yeah, I wonder if that's a metaphor. I wonder if that's an allegory for what's currently happening in our fucking climate right now. Eventually, after another time skip and a decent amount of character deaths, rip Sid, it's revealed at the end that the entire plot, as well as all of civilization, was caused by Ultima, a shape-shifting alien who's a part of a civilization hive mind who created humans as well as the Mother Crystals solely so they could wait for someone like Clive who can become Ifrit and absorb other dominants' icons so that they can become a vessel for Ultima to take over, so that Ultima can cast a spell. It's not entirely clear. By the end, Joshua dies, Ultima gets punched in the fucking face, and Clive destroys the last Mother Crystal, removing magic from the world completely, while ultimately succumbing to the amount of power flowing through his body, leaving everyone to think that he's dead. Again. Then the game time jumps one last fucking time to the far distant future, showing a world without magic, thriving with luscious greenery, where the tale of Clive and his friends is seen as a fantasy. A Final Fantasy. Obviously, I skipped over a shit ton of characters and smaller plot points like the subplot about Benedicta and Hugo, or even some significant character stuff like the death of Annabella. I didn't even mention King Barnabas and his weird obsession with his mom, or even his twink general who just dies. That's all he's here for, all of which would take far too long to explain. And I'm not trying to make another super long video. The dev team had cited the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones as a clear inspiration, and it's very obvious when you begin playing the game. Sometimes it leans into it a little bit too much with all the fucks, the sex, and the gruesome death scenes in the opening few hours that's not really apparent later on in the game. Like, did I need for Annabella and Elwyn's relationships to be historically accurate? No. Not at all. But the most notable part is that there's a fuck ton of jargon about armies, battle strategies, and political debates. While I appreciate that 16 clearly tries to prevent it from becoming too confusing, with the addition of the active time lore, which just explains who characters are and the relations to the story at that point, sometimes it would all be too much and still cause my eyes to glaze over when it got really heavy-handed. Like whenever a map comes out in this game, like I'm still listening, but I'm just somewhere else mentally, man. 16 has got to be the biggest Final Fantasy that I've personally played. It's a long game, coming in at about 38 hours, with me kind of rushing at the very end since I needed to see how it ended. It's not really a bad thing at all. The game was able to hook me in from the very beginning. Of course, there was some textbook RPG stuff that you kind of expect with the genre. The opening is long, your combat and exploration is fairly limited for the first 2 or so hours. You even play the same boss fight twice? And yet, whenever I turned this game on, I was just completely locked in. And where 16 really excels is the meld between serious fantasy and what I can only really describe as action anime schlock. Something that few other developers really excel at in video games outside of maybe Platinum Games and Capcom with Dragon's Dogma. RPGs about killing a god and defying fate, it's an age-old story and damn near a running joke at this point. However, 16's story benefits from how much it plays all the cheesier parts of RPGs completely straight. The game is able to have nuanced conversations about the concept of free will and what comes along with it. There's a plot point brought up near the middle of the game where Clive and Joe begin to free bearers slowly throughout Valisthea one by one. However, Sid points out to Clive very early on that it's going to get worse way before it's going to get better. And it does. There's a specific scene after the second time jump, I believe, after Sid's death, where the bearers that he and Jill freeze fucking despise him, because all he's doing is making the lives of bearers who are still in captivity more difficult, at least in the short term. Then there's the second battle between King Barnabas, Ultima's ultra-religious right-hand man, and Clive that is quite literally a battle between the two ideologies of the power to choose and seeking freedom in subjugation, and giving in to what fate has in store for you. The game will even talk about the destructiveness of monarchies and how slavery bad, while also having fights in space and an ending that literally whittles down to the power was the friends we made along the way. And it all works at the same time, simply because of the sincerity. All of the different parts of 16 are played equally straight and end up balancing each other out. There's other themes about the interpretation of religious texts and how people in power use them as a means to an end for their own personal gain. It's kind of Ultima's entire goal, since he claims that all he does is for the sake of creation, but instead the entire events of the game and his goal to wipe out his own creation, humanity, are both a result of his own fear and his hubris. But then there's the scene where Clive tells Hugo, Titan's dominant, that he killed his girlfriend, and I swear, hand on the Kingdom Hearts 2 art book, it plays out like a "it was me all along" scene, with a big dramatic boom as Clive reveals that he's the one that killed Benedicta all those years ago. Then the two of them yell, "Now die," as loud as they possibly can, and then the boss fight starts. It's the coolest shit I've ever seen. Or when Odin parts the sea with his sword. Scratch that. That's the coolest shit I've ever seen. Or the fight with Bahamut where Ifrit and Phoenix Dragon Ball Z fuse together to beat the shit out of him. Scratch that. That's the coolest. The writing really makes each and every one of these characters feel like an integral part to the party, but also keeps you invested and caring about whether or not they're going to make it. Usually, I'm the first to say that a game's plot is easy to guess where it's going. I'm not clairvoyant, I just watch and read a lot of stuff. But in my experience, 16 had so much up its sleeve that I never knew what was going to come next. Case in point, I initially thought Clive's mom would be revealed to be Ultima's puppet, literally trying to give birth to a perfect vessel and break down his will enough to take him over. So, imagine my surprise when I saw Dion stab his little brother. I was constantly guessing up until the very end. So when characters close to Clive, like Gav, his right-hand man, or his uncle Byron, or even Sid's adoptive daughter Mid were introduced, I was extremely concerned for their well-being. Mostly because they all add their own sense of brevity and life into a pretty bleak story. I appreciate all the little things shown, like how close Gav and Clive become after Sid's death, or just how openly Clive and Jill love each other. Jill and Clive's reunion being the spark for both of their character arcs was kind of genius, and made their eventual romance feel both earned and quite natural, at least for a Final Fantasy game. It's rare to see the childhood friend trope done well, but both of them felt well established in their own right, and you can totally understand why they both care for each other. I can't really think of any other game that earns a scene where our love interests are completely naked on the beach, and it doesn't feel like fan service. It's actually a really sweet and mature scene that I really liked. I didn't mean in that way. Alright, whatever. In any other game, Joshua would be the protagonist, but Clive's arc of shame and self-hatred makes him far more interesting than most other Final Fantasy protagonists. In the build up to the sequence of accepting that not only is he the other fire icon Ifrit, but that he's solely responsible for his brother's presumed death, is a perfect example of the serious melded with the schlock, since he solves it by beating the shit out of himself. Just as Clive figures out that he killed Joshua, robbing him of his only reason to keep living, Sid comes to realize that his own goal shouldn't be for a better place for bearers to die in peace, but a better place to live. A dream that Clive helped him understand that was cultivated in him by his father, the same dream that both Clive and Jill would strive for after Sid's death, and eventually achieve by the end of the game. Jill and Clive may sort of been each other's savior when it came to the darkness of their own lives being slaves and what they were forced to do, but it's through their love, and most importantly, their free will, that they're able to create a better world. And this game ends with a QTE where you punch the villain in the face as hard as you fucking can. There's scenes where the dominants turn into their icons and the camera will zoom into their veins, almost like the NOS scenes from the Fast and Furious movies. This game is fucking perfect. It's really hard to convey just how well this all works. Without playing it firsthand, it might seem like whiplash seeing all the different footage slapped together. But as you'll eventually understand more when it comes to the combat, 16 is a game that's best experienced with the controller in your hands. When you're able to see all 40 or so hours for yourself, it's easy to appreciate how subdued the story allows itself to be at points. Pondering on what it means to allow oneself to change and become better after a life of being forced to do terrible things, while also having a plot twist that's just ripped from Stranger of Paradise of all things. That's probably a big spoiler for that game, but we'll talk about that one eventually. I really loved the ending of 16. Did Joshua survive and write the book? Did Clive write it under Joshua's pen name since he's the one narrating at the end of the story? We won't know until Final Fantasy XVI Advent Children releases. This is the third Final Fantasy game I've played in a row where the main character dies, or is at least implied to be. I should note that Clive doesn't definitively kick the bucket on screen. It's more so kept up in the air for people like me to stress about at 3 AM years down the line. The entire game sort of builds towards this ending, with the setup of petrification being the price that both bearers and dominants have to pay. Something that Sid himself succumbs to and Jill begins to suffer from towards the latter half. What really got me in the gut was not Clive possibly dying, but him thinking back about his and Joshua's lives from when they were younger, only to cut to Clive holding his dead brother in his arms. It just, ooh, it's so good. My Star is probably the saddest Final Fantasy song I've heard so far. It's got this solemnness that comes with the piano and the beautiful vocals. It's just so delicious. I love that fucking song. It's a cherry on top of a really, really good ending. But Clive saying that Ultima's fantasy will be his final one was a bit too cheesy for my taste. And oh, the epilogue is just such a good addition. I love that it shows a world without magic and that the story of the icon has become fiction. It's really beautiful. And it cements how wrong Ultima is, and it makes the whole journey feel so worth it. And of course, that doesn't mean that 16's story is flawless. My biggest gripe specifically is the pacing. If I'm being honest, a good 7 to even 8 hours could be cut out of 16, with most of what's left out coming from the main missions that have nothing to do with the story, and aren't even detrimental to the world building. Whenever you visit a new town in the story, you have a required mission that's usually some sort of fetch quest. I do appreciate the development and amount of detail that's put into all the villages across Valisthea, and credit where credit's due, some of these missions are really well done, and can even add a new perspective to 16's world, like the one involving the Dame in Northreach. But the rest are not like this at all. Most of these feel superfluous and even like bloat. These missions are the equivalent of going back for extra stuffing on Thanksgiving. It's not the worst, but there's better things that you could be putting on your plate instead. And all of these missions combined make for some very hot and cold pacing. Certain chapters will move at a lightning speed, specifically whenever Dominance or Ultima are the focus. And it's pretty understandable why this is the case. Probably the opening 10 or so hours is pretty much just setting up characters in the world of Valisthea before the time jump. And the latter half, once Ultima is revealed, is much more time sensitive, having a tunnel vision on destroying him as well as his minions. All of this makes sense, and even the characters will press about how little time there is to save the world, only for the game to stop me to save villages from the Akashic or help make an engine with mid. I should point out that neither of these are bad missions in the slightest. Not what I'm saying at all. I understand why all of these missions are included here. They're meant to be a breather after big boss fights and set pieces, allowing the player to slow down, maybe grind a bit, do some side quests. However, I'm simply saying that all of these missions can be executed in a more interesting way. These sorts of side quests have lots and lots of dialogue in their respective towns, which can kind of be a hard sell, since as beautiful as they all are, not every town is as interesting as the next. And this is all much more noticeable in a game like 16, since its characters and main story are so well told, and all of these feel like they're extracted from a completely different game. Almost like walking around and talking to NPCs was only required since it's what's expected from a Final Fantasy game. Look, all I'm saying is that there's better ways to communicate these themes and allow the player to slow down now and then without having such cookie-cutter side content that's required in the main story. The NPCs aren't terrible. I liked the Dame, Otto, Vivian, even Harpocrates. I even appreciate the choice to kill off certain shopkeepers when the hideaway is attacked halfway through the game. That might sound like a backhanded insult, but I promise you it is a compliment. It's an interesting thing to make the player feel the loss that the characters are feeling once the hideaway is destroyed. But what makes this so confusing is that 16 is completely willing to shake up the foundation of what Final Fantasy and its conventions are. The entire concept of having 2 fire summons at the same time, something that should never be possible, or the less focus on JRPG party mechanics and emphasis on DMC style combat are both concepts that completely change what the series is known for and how its stories play out. So this game's pace breakers to be no more than required side quests is underwhelming. And it's a bit telling that these aren't able to be replayed at all with stage replay. Anyway, time for the devil to cry. The combat itself has sort of been the most contentious point about 16, mostly since it completely strays away from what the overall consensus is for a Final Fantasy game. If you've seen my video on 15, you know that I don't subscribe to that idea at fucking all. For a franchise that sold itself as an anthology, you'd think that the fanbase would subscribe to the idea of each entry being different, but that seems to not be the norm here. As I mentioned earlier, 16 completely lacks a party system at all, save for giving restricted commands to your dog, Torgal, while all the other members like Jill, Sid, and Joshua are completely controlled by AI. You don't even change their equipment or team management at all. The closest you get is changing their outfits with the new free update. That's really it. There aren't any upgrading elemental spells, they pretty much stay where they are from the very beginning of the game, and healing is done solely through a limited amount of potions. The RPG stats have been limited to simply upgrading equipment, something that's in almost every other AAA game, regardless of genre, which has led to a lot of people saying that this isn't enough of an RPG or a JRPG, or arguing what genre it falls in. To me, the action RPG genre has always been sort of a melding pot for a shit ton of different kinds of games under a sort of catch-all moniker. The game lacks a party system because with Clive's ability to absorb dominance, it makes no sense to play as anybody else at all. And the equipment does whittle down to a very simplified variation of a Monster Hunter-esque crafting system, where you obtain materials in the field and then go back to your blacksmith in your hideout to upgrade your weapon. But that's really all it needed to be. Anymore, and I think it kind of would have gotten in its own way. Since 16 is the most combat-focused Final Fantasy game I've played since Stranger of Paradise. It's much closer to a DMC or a Dragon's Dogma than any other installment that's come before it, mainline or spin-off. It honestly does not matter what genre name 16 falls under. What matters is that the combat is fun, and there's lots of space for creative uses of the icon abilities as you level up throughout the game. The almost endless amount of powers within a very limited amount of slots forces the player to experiment with the game's mechanics in order to find a playstyle that fits them, or at least the situation that they're in. Especially the fact that you can refund your points and spend them again with no penalty at all. The game very much wants you to switch up your playstyle with different situations. Certain abilities work best once an enemy is staggered, allowing you to deal far more damage, while others like Rift Slip, I hate that name, it's such a fucking tongue twister. Rift Slip are literally just an animation cancel, allowing you to get back into combat as fast as possible. Like any good action game, it's easy enough for anyone to grasp, and deep enough for those who really want to understand it. It's fast, fluid, and it felt like it'd offer a decent enough challenge on harder difficulties. However, I will say that this is the time that I'm finally pressing the "this game is a little too easy" button. The boss fights, which I'll talk about more shortly, are extremely forgiving, having a very generous checkpoint system and will revive you with additional health items, which is pretty understandable since some of those can go on for upwards of 40 or so minutes. But even then, I still died very few times in 16 on normal difficulty without grinding at all. I personally didn't mind this most of the time. It allowed me space to mix and match powers without being punished too hard. I will say that the random encounters do get a little bit repetitive in the last few hours, mostly since there aren't any enemies who can really match your level of power with all the icons available. So instead, the amount of Orcish and Akashic enemies you fight are almost doubled, just needlessly extending the chapters. I'd have preferred less enemies that were higher level or even more mini-bosses, rather than lots of mobs that take a decent amount of time to defeat. Also, locking Final Fantasy mode behind completion just gives people less options. Had it been available at the beginning of the game and was just another difficulty option, I think the combat complaints would be less common. The scale of 16's world is grand, to say the least. All of the explorable areas are far bigger than you'd expect from a linear game like this. Apparently, the dev team, Creative Business Unit 3, explicitly took criticism from Final Fantasy XV, specifically when it came to the open world, into account when developing 16. And I'm not quite sure that I like that. I don't know, unless it's a YouTube video or a diss track. I don't like when things are made in response to responses. With that being said, the end result is a beautiful world that can be explored without having an expansive, wide open world, since that wouldn't fit what 16's going for. That doesn't mean that this game is small. While the regions might be separated, they're still fucking humongous. And I will say that the fact that Clive can't run does make exploration a little bit more annoying than it should be, although you are able to ride chocobos after a specific side quest later on, so there is that. Visually, Valisthea is striking. A lot of these landscapes are just peak visual design. The skyboxes early on in the game are so fucking pretty, man. It also helps that the soundtrack for 16 is fucking amazing. The overworld theme is a bit of an earworm, and I couldn't stop humming it around the house. It's so calming and refreshing to listen to as you run around the open fields. Cid's theme is so fucking amazing and laid back. It fits his character so damn well. All of the various town themes have their own unique vibe. Just the whole OST is able to capture all the different aspects of fantasy, from the more somber, low-key, Baroque sounds to the more grand-scale, epic music you'd hear in a film. I say all that to set up that this game has a boss fight with Titan that's as tall as a skyscraper with a 2000s techno rock theme, and it's my favorite part of the game. 16's boss fights are the game's biggest selling points. It's definitely back of the box material. It's hard to explain it unless you've seen it, but if you've seen the Final Fantasy VII commercial that was going around that only showed the CGs, if a commercial like that was made for 16, it'd only be these fucking boss fights. Whenever you think the dev team won't be able to top the last one, they always find some way to do so. Each and every one of these bosses takes the scale of both the world and the soundtrack and dials them up as high as they can possibly be. Even the opening fight between Ifrit and Phoenix, which is this on-rails Panzer Dragoon-like, still feels like a very large scale to start the game out on, and I was unsure if the devs would be able to keep that level of grandiosity up. And believe you me, they do. Like, fighting Bahamut in space was not on my Final Fantasy XVI bingo card at all. I also love the detail that as Clive begins to accept more and more that he's also a dominant, Ifrit's gameplay evolves from this clunky, almost Final Fantasy X feeling combat into something that's much closer to the rest of the game. Insane powers and all. More storytelling through gameplay. You love to see it. These fights are so fucking good, dude. These fights are so fucking good. The ultimate one was a little disappointing. It's just sort of more Ultima, if that makes sense. Nothing crazy. It's kind of a shame. In terms of post-game, 16 has quite a bit to offer, but it completely depends on what kind of player you are. Pretty much all of the main missions after the first time jump can be replayed through stage replay, which is straightforward, but also arcade mode, which grades you on your combat like it's a fucking Hideki Kamiya game. It's fun to speedrun the missions since some of these can go upwards of an hour to an hour and a half, and it was kind of nice fighting earlier game bosses with late game powers. There's a list of bounties you can do as well as a lot of side quests. Arguably too many. Although for the latter, I will say that you really have to like the world of 16 and be willing to sit through some PS2 Kingdom Hearts cutscenes with minimal animation to enjoy the side quests. Most of the villages offer little to no gameplay reason to return to them outside of the side quests, and many of those are just fetching something or killing something, which is what you'd expect from an RPG. Some of them were surprising, like the mission where Clive reunites with his chocobo Ambrosia, or the mission where you retrieve flowers from Mosaria, which increases the effect of curatives. Those offer an additional reason or reward for the player for interacting with them. The hunts are probably the best thing in the game to do after the story, since they're just optional bosses. Pretty much any mission with some sort of substantial reward was worth playing, be it a fun boss or something useful, even some nice character stuff. However, some of the side quests that attempt to focus on story just don't really hit the mark. I've seen online that many of the later ones are interesting, specifically those centered on the main cast like Jill and Joshua, and those have a reward of them becoming permanent party members, which is awesome. However, as good as I hear that they are, I just don't feel compelled enough to play them. Many of these aren't any better than the ones that are required to be done in the main story. These all kind of feel like they're here for those who weren't satiated out of the 40 or so hours they got out of the main game and just craved more. But I myself have seen my fair share. There's some other minor complaints I could tell you about. I don't like that the entire game stops whenever you level up. It completely gets in the way of combat sometimes. I really cannot explain enough how much I don't like those secondary main missions, some of which just feel extremely random, like one where you get to choose between having Jill, your main party member and canonical love interest, or Taria, the hideaway doctor, join you for a romantic dinner. Also, the game will constantly send the characters back to the hideaway only for a cutscene or two, only to go back out into the world again right after. But really, I enjoyed my time with Final Fantasy XVI. A great game should leave a hole in your chest once you complete it and almost make you feel a little bit empty. And man, did 16 do that and then some. The story is almost like if Game of Thrones was on Toonami. The gameplay is some of the most addictive I've had the chance to get my hands on, and the music and presentation are up there. It's such a beautiful game. It encapsulates everything that the series has become with its hard medieval setting and fantasy elements, as well as a dollop of sci-fi near the latter half. Two sides of the franchise that have been coexisting since Final Fantasy VI, as well as looks towards the horizon with its combat, story, and sense of style, embodying the philosophy of series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi. It might not be your thing, but hey, that's totally within your right. Give it a few years and the next one will probably tickle your fancy. That almost sounds like a threat. Anyway, don't forget to share this on AOL.
100 first prize winners get the soundtrack from Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. And one grand prize winner scores their own PlayStation 2 computer entertainment system.
The dream is always the same.
Go to Toonami.com all this week for your chance to win. And see the movie in theaters July 11th.
Let's move out, people.